activism. Now, COVID-19 has tested us in a way not seen really since the Second World War, has brought out the best in many parts of British society. People have found new ways to rally to support one another, new social networks, little platoons gathering in WhatsApp groups. And the pandemic has also laid bare gaps in our social fabric. Many families and households pushed to the edge. Loneliness, exclusion, poverty, mental health problems, all of these demand attention. So, in this programme, we'll talk about what has worked well and how to hang on to it, and later, what has not worked well and how to improve it. How do we build resilience to cope with shocks? I'm with 4 guests, all on the front line of these issues. Reverend John Edward Funnell is the pastor of Nothra Church in Abersachen near Pontypool. A Londoner by upbringing, he's now a pillar of his community in the heart of the South Wales valleys. Rachel Wolfe is a public policy specialist. She co-wrote the general election manifesto that helped Boris Johnson's Conservatives to victory in 2019. She now works at the think tank Public First. Toby Lloyd is a former head of policy at the housing charity Shelter, was an advisor on housing and local government to Theresa May when she was Prime Minister, and now chairs the No Place Left Behind Commission, which campaigns for improvement in our environment, housing, parks, streets. And Dame Louise Casey, a crossbench peer specialising in social welfare, a former czar advising 5 successive prime ministers on homelessness, troubled families, integration and antisocial behaviour. And at the start of the pandemic was the driving force behind the radical and much praised everyone in policy to get rough sleepers in England off the streets and into accommodation. And I wonder, panel, whether I might just ask you each whether the pandemic has in some way affected your year, perhaps energising the work you're doing. John, first of all, in South Wales.
Yes, as a church, our entire ministry is built on loving God and loving your neighbour. So we have done what we have always tried to do during this pandemic. Nothing has really changed in regards to our ministry serving the community, but what the pandemic has done is increased demand. So energised is the right word. We've always had our food banks, homeless work, ministries to youth, underage mums. Our church is open every day of the week serving the community in one shape or form. But the pandemic has brought many more people in to embrace and use our services.
Just by way of example, just tell us about your Christmas carol service.
Yes, so we hold a carol service each year under a rather iconic mining arch where we get about 1,000 people coming each year. It's the heart of our valley community, an icon of the post-industrial age, I suppose. And we held it online this year for obvious reasons, and we had over 15,000 people tune in live to watch it. So that was a real encouragement, and it allowed us to still create a community hub, albeit in the virtual space.
Rachel, how's the pandemic affected your year?
Well, my year, like many of us, has been dominated by having small children who are not at school. So I don't want to pretend it's been energising, but it has been hard not to be impressed by the entrepreneurialism of, for example, teachers who came together to create Oak Academy and provide lessons on every subject at incredible speed for children, and the sheer number of organisations, companies, national, local, small, who've been really trying to find ways to help, donating laptops, offering support, even if, there are some things that fundamentally they cannot fix.
Toby, how about you? Toby Lloyd.
So my experience of the last year has been that it's made us all hyper-local. Suddenly we've all been much, much more aware of our very, very immediate environment because we're not going anywhere else. And that's meant that we've all increased our experience of each other and of our local places. So there's been a massive increase in neighbourliness, which has been really welcome. And there's, Create Streets did some survey work that found that people really have got to know their neighbours much more as a result of lockdown. But it's also kind of highlighted, I think, the importance of the physical environment and not just, although it has made us all appreciate things like parks massively, but even the even closer to home, immediate hyper-local environment. So your local street, the exact kind of layout of your buildings really matters. So it turns out, for example, on my street, some of the houses have a tiny front garden. I've just got enough to store a bin and a bike, but it's enough to sit out and have a conversation with neighbours, and it makes a massive difference. So I think we've all noticed how much more we interact with each other on the street, and therefore the quality of those streets and whether you can sit and have a conversation and whether there are cars thundering up and down it has made a huge difference. Yeah. So the thing I've really noticed is just how much my kids have started to enjoy actually kind of rollerblading up and down the road for the first time.
Right. We'll pick up on that theme. Louise Casey, I'd be particularly interested in your work on rough sleeping, because this has been, I mean, it's been amazing in a way how quickly we have managed to make a difference. And I don't know how lasting that's going to be, but you've been very involved in that.
Yes, I mean, I think this year has been a year of enormous highs and enormous lows, but one of the highs has to be that we've managed to prove to ourselves that we don't have to have thousands of people sleeping out on the streets. And actually, very, very quickly last year, within a fortnight, we had essentially persuaded everybody across the country to both open up the hotels for homeless people and get everybody out of the communal night shelters, which were sort of mattresses on the floor, people sleeping next door to each other, which clearly would have been, really dangerous. And we would have had a significant loss of life in those scenarios, as well as to get people off the streets. And we were down to the hundreds. I mean, I think it was like 6,000 hotel beds I had to get open within about a fortnight. And then overall, 33,000 homeless people and rough sleepers have gone through that accommodation. And though it's not a lasting solution, there are two things I take from it. One, which is when we want to do something, we can, no matter how tricky and challenging a problem is. And I think that's a really good and important lesson, actually, as we go forward, as we come through the pandemic. And two, just the way that people threw themselves at it. I mean, it wasn't just me. We had loads of people from organisations like St Mungo's and Thames Reach and Crisis, volunteers in these hotels. We had people running the hotels that are used to commercial travellers, and they actually stayed on to help homeless people. And some of those hotels are still going. And the numbers haven't gone back up quite to what they were pre-pandemic, Evan, which is great. And it wouldn't have happened without the government. That's one of the things I just wanted to say at the outset of this. It's a real example of when the government decides it wants to do something, it can do it. And I think that's a phenomenal lesson for all of us, actually, to have hope on very difficult issues.
I mean, I think we've all impressed ourselves in certain ways at what we can do when we put our mind to it over the course of the pandemic. We've heard your examples, nice examples of things that have gone rather well in many cases. We've heard the examples from the listeners. Let's just focus on the positive to start with, and we'll talk about the gaps a little later. But I guess I'm interested in what's made this possible. Is there, Rachel, maybe you can help us on this. Do you think there's a culture of people are slightly nervous about being do-gooding, and somehow when the pandemic came along, that lifted and people didn't feel they needed an excuse to be trying to launch into voluntary work? And is there something that made us averse to that before? I don't know.
I think that two things happened with the pandemic, and then there's kind of one underlying thing. The first is, of course, people had a direction for their volunteering and their help. It was very clear what needed to be done, and therefore it felt that if you were going to throw yourself into something, there was a direction for it. And also, picking up on earlier comments, I do think the fact that we have all been local and our lives have been local and we've been in our communities has made a difference. I think, though, the other thing that the pandemic has made even more stark, and I think is one of the underlying factors why some of us feel the community has declined, is time poverty. So there are lots of people in the pandemic who have been beyond time poor as they have tried to juggle all the different demands on them. But in general, as we have become a world where everybody works, including women, we've generally, I think, lost quite a lot of the people who used to devote themselves to the community and are now back in their local community and might be starting to do so again.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, the other thing, Toby, and you, Toby, mentioned the neighbourhood nature of a lot of the social action going on. The other thing, though, is actually WhatsApp groups or email groups, but WhatsApp is definitely of the time, isn't it? That has made a lot of this much more possible than it used to be. It was really interesting in the examples we heard. People basically using WhatsApp have managed to do extraordinary things.
Absolutely. They've used street WhatsApp groups to do extraordinary things, but also to do much more prosaic things. Like, I have to admit, I created a WhatsApp group for our street, and it has done absolutely nothing in terms of, rallying around and implementing social change. But it's done a huge amount of just connecting people, mainly to share, cat photos and little stories about the street. But it's really brought people together.
John, talk me through what we can do to hang on to some of this. We don't want to lose this, do we?
No, we don't. We've been very fortunate as a church in that on the years leading up to the pandemic, we've repositioned ourselves as a community hub, which has meant that we've been known to everyone in the area who want to do good. They come to us to do it. So we have really been a channel for this new society that has been shaped through the pandemic. We've had lots of people offer to deliver food parcels, even though they're not part of the church, that they've used us as a vehicle for that service. And I suppose, to retain that would be to keep those links, keep people engaged. And that's what we've tried to do as a church.
Do they have to believe in God to be involved?
No, not at all. We've got a number of people that help us. Again, for an example, with our food parcel delivery, we had the furloughed British gas drivers drive hundreds of parcels for us. The local parole service were delivering food parcels for us. As a church, it gives us an opportunity to meet with people we wouldn't otherwise meet and share our message with them. But all people from all walks of life have been seeing the church as a hub of service to the community. We're very thankful for all of their love and support.
Louise, are you optimistic that we will hang on to some of these WhatsApp groups, or will they decay as the pandemic passes into history, do you think?
I think it'll get a lot quieter. I think the reason that this is so powerful, and I've listened to your previous programmes, and I think the theme is the pandemic gave us something to knit us together, to bind us together, to fight something. And it's real. People in the NHS were fighting for people's lives, and we know that they were fighting for people's lives, and we know that our job was to protect each other as best we can. And that translated into government policy, where I was concerned with the Everyone In campaign. When something is bad, people come out and they do something about it. People band together against something. And that's a very different dynamic to coming together because we want the world to be a better place. I mean, that's why we'll rally around the Olympics, because it was wonderful and it brought us all together. Some of the depth of the pandemic has gone so deep that people like John, you're doing just such wonderful, unbelievable work in two ways. One, it's getting basics out to people that otherwise won't have them, such as food. But secondly, it's a spiritual element to it. And even if you're not religious, we've all been caught up in kind of clapping for the NHS week in, week out at the beginning. There's been kind of symbolic kind of humanity, which I think is one of the most extraordinary things about this pandemic, and in different ways has come up on the previous two programmes that you've been airing.
Well, look, take a pause, because I want us to hear a couple of other pandemic experiences from listeners, ones that perhaps remind us that good work there has been, but lessons learned too of social problems that we might try to address.
My name's Michelle Barber and I live in Cheriton, which is just next to Folkestone. So in September last year, about 400 men who were refugees were moved into Napier Barracks. And some of us noticed that really they didn't have shoes and they didn't have coats and they were in a bit of a bad way. So I set up a WhatsApp group with about 10 women and we started to collect donations. And we ended up being able to provide shoes for every single man who needed a pair, and clothing and coats. One of the young women in the group decided that she would use some of the donations that we had for the community, and she set up this fantastic group, Folkestone's Community Clothes Bank. And the level of poverty and inequality that's really hidden in the community is quite shocking and appalling. People ask for things, really the barest minimum. And I think inequality of food, of healthcare, of shelter is about all sorts of people. It's not just about the men who are refugees. It's not about individual groups. It's about a whole swathe of people who have fallen through the net, particularly through the pandemic, who've become more isolated and their poverty has become worse.
My name is Penny Jordan and I live in central London. I am a visually impaired person and I have been sheltered as well because of various chronic diseases. The tsunami